there is something strange happening in the modern world. We have more information than any generation before us, yet clarity feels rarer than ever. We are constantly connected, constantly informed, constantly stimulated, and still something essential feels missing. It's as if the more we consume, the less we understand. The louder the world becomes, the harder it is to hear anything real. Look around. The most confident voices are not always the most thoughtful. The most visible figures are rarely the most reflective. Speed is praised, simplicity is rewarded, depth is treated like a burden, and patience, once considered a virtue, is now mistaken for weakness. This isn't accidental. We are living in a time that quietly discourages wisdom, not by banning it, not by attacking it directly, but by making it inconvenient. Wisdom requires slowness. It demands humility. It asks uncomfortable questions, and most importantly, it refuses to fit neatly into slogans, trends, or algorithms. In a culture built on instant reactions and constant entertainment, wisdom doesn't disappear, it gets drowned out. And when wisdom fades, something else takes its place: noise. We begin to confuse confidence with understanding. We mistake repetition for truth. We mistake popularity for insight. And slowly, without noticing, we stop asking why and start settling for what feels good. This is how a culture loses its depth, not in one dramatic collapse, but through 1,000 small concessions. Shorter attention spans, simpler narratives, endless distractions. Until thinking deeply feels exhausting and not thinking at all feels normal. But to understand what's happening, we must first be honest about what wisdom actually is. Wisdom is not intelligence. It is not trivia. It is not memorizing facts or winning arguments. Wisdom is perspective. It is the ability to hold complexity without panicking, to sit with uncertainty without rushing to judgment, to recognize how little we truly know and remain curious instead of defensive. The ancient philosophers understood this. Socrates didn't claim to be wise because he had answers. He was considered wise because he questioned himself more than others. Lao Tzu spoke of knowing when to stop. Marcus Aurelius wrote not to impress the world, but to discipline his own mind. Wisdom was inward before it was public. Today, the opposite is encouraged. We perform certainty, we broadcast opinions, we build identities around being right. And the more visible someone becomes, the less room they have to say, I don't know. So instead of reflection, we get reaction. Instead of dialogue, we get noise. Instead of understanding, we get division. Ask yourself something uncomfortable. When was the last time you saw thoughtful conversation spread faster than outrage? When was the last time complexity was rewarded instead of punished? When was the last time silence felt more powerful than shouting? In the modern world, silence makes you invisible, and invisibility is treated like failure. But history tells a different story. The people who shaped civilizations were rarely the loudest in their time. They were the ones thinking when others were distracted, observing when others were reacting, questioning when others were conforming. Yet today, entertainers dominate thinkers. Speed replaces substance, and wisdom, because it cannot be compressed into seconds, is quietly pushed aside. This creates a strange paradox. We say we value intelligence, but we reward impulsiveness. We say we want truth, but we avoid discomfort. We say we admire depth, but we scroll past it. And over time, this reshapes the human mind. When a society stops practicing reflection, it becomes easier to manipulate. Simpler stories become more attractive. Emotional reactions replace careful thought. And gradually, people stop trusting their own judgment. Not because they are incapable, but because they are never given the space to develop it. This is how superficiality becomes dominant. Not through stupidity alone, but through exhaustion. When people are constantly overwhelmed, they reach for what is easiest, what feels familiar, what confirms their existing beliefs. Depth requires energy, wisdom requires courage. And in an overstimulated world, courage becomes rare. But here is the truth most people avoid. The loss of wisdom is not only cultural, it is personal. Every time we choose distraction over reflection, we participate in it. Every time we react instead of think, scroll instead of sit, consume instead of question, we reinforce the very system we complain about. This isn't about blaming technology or society alone, it's about awareness. Because wisdom has always been inconvenient. Even in ancient times, it was not popular. Philosophers were mocked, exiled, even executed. What's different now is that wisdom isn't attacked, it's ignored. And being ignored is far more dangerous. When depth disappears, life becomes flatter. Meaning becomes harder to find. And people begin to feel restless, anxious, and disconnected without knowing why. They feel busy but empty, informed but unsure, entertained but unsatisfied. This inner tension is not accidental, it's the result of living without reflection. And yet, despite everything, wisdom has not vanished. It survives quietly, in moments when you question your assumptions, in discomfort that doesn't go away with distraction, in the sense that something deeper is calling you beneath the noise. If you're listening to this, you already feel it. You sense that not everything loud is true, that not everything popular is meaningful, that not everything urgent deserves your attention. That awareness is the beginning of wisdom. Not answers, not certainty, but awareness. In the next session, we'll explore why modern systems actively pull us away from introspection, how distraction became a substitute for meaning, and why wisdom, by its very nature, threatens a world built on speed and surface. Because before wisdom can return, we must understand exactly where it was lost. And more importantly, why we allowed it to slip away. If this session resonated with you, take a moment to like the video. It helps this kind of thinking reach others who are searching beneath the noise. If wisdom feels absent today, it's not because humans suddenly became incapable of depth. It's because the environment around us quietly trains us away from it. Wisdom needs space. Modern life removes space. Think about how your day begins. Notifications arrive before your thoughts do. News headlines compete for your emotions before you've even centered yourself. Your attention is pulled outward immediately, and once it's fragmented, it rarely returns fully intact. This isn't weakness, it's conditioning. We live inside systems designed not to inform but to capture. Your attention is the most valuable resource in the modern world, and everything is competing for it. Apps, media, advertising, outrage, fear, pleasure. Not because they care about you, but because distracted people are predictable people. And predictable people are easier to guide. In earlier civilizations, reflection was built into daily life. Silence wasn't something to escape, it was something to enter. People walked, thought, debated, contemplated. Wisdom was cultivated slowly like a garden. Today, stillness feels unnatural. The moment silence appears, we reach for stimulation. The phone, the feed, the noise. We mistake boredom for emptiness when in reality boredom is often the doorway to insight. This constant stimulation does something subtle to the mind. It shortens patience, it weakens focus, it trains us to crave conclusions instead of understanding. Over time, we lose the ability to sit with questions, and wisdom begins with questions. When systems reward speed, wisdom becomes inefficient. When algorithms reward emotional reactions, nuance becomes invisible. When productivity becomes the highest virtue, reflection feels like laziness. So wisdom isn't destroyed, it's outcompeted. Consider how public conversations work now. Complex issues are reduced to slogans. Moral questions are forced into sides. You're either for or against, right or wrong, with no space in between. And if you hesitate, if you say it's complicated, you're treated as weak or indecisive. But wisdom lives in complexity. It understands that reality rarely fits into clean categories, that human behavior is layered, that truth often arrives slowly, not all at once. A culture that fears complexity fears wisdom. This is why thoughtful voices rarely dominate timelines. They don't provoke fast enough. They don't outrage enough. They don't simplify reality into something easily consumable. So instead, we elevate certainty, even when that certainty is shallow, even when it's wrong. Confidence becomes more valuable than accuracy. Volume becomes more valuable than clarity. And slowly we start believing that whoever speaks the loudest must know something we don't. This is how authority shifts from wisdom to visibility. But visibility is not truth, and repetition is not understanding. The philosopher Hannah Arendt warned that the most dangerous thing is not ignorance but thoughtlessness, the refusal to examine what we are doing. Not evil intentions, but unexamined actions. Thoughtlessness spreads easily in distracted environments. When people don't reflect, they follow patterns. When they don't question narratives, they absorb them. When they don't slow down, they outsource their thinking. This is where wisdom becomes threatening, because a wise person interrupts the flow. They ask, why is this being pushed? Who benefits from this belief? What happens if I don't react? Those questions disrupt momentum. And momentum is what systems rely on. So wisdom is not encouraged. It's tolerated at best, ignored at worst. But there's another layer to this. The modern world doesn't just distract us, it teaches us to fear introspection. Because introspection leads to uncomfortable realizations. It forces you to confront contradictions inside yourself. It challenges your identity. It reveals where you've been conforming instead of choosing. And that can destabilize the image you've built. So instead of looking inward, we look outward. We measure ourselves by metrics, likes, views, approval. We borrow identities instead of discovering them. We chase validation because it's faster than self-understanding. But borrowed identities collapse under pressure. And when they do, people feel lost. Not because they lack options, but because they lack inner direction. This is why anxiety and emptiness coexist with constant stimulation. When wisdom disappears, meaning becomes fragile. Psychologist Viktor Frankl observed that when people lose meaning, they distract themselves with pleasure. Not because pleasure is bad, but because it's immediate. It numbs the deeper hunger without feeding it. And that hunger never fully goes away. It whispers when distractions fade. It stirs in moments of quiet dissatisfaction. It shows up as restlessness you can't explain. That hunger is not for entertainment. It's for orientation. Wisdom gives orientation. It tells you what matters. It anchors you when everything else shifts. Without it, life becomes reactive, a series of responses instead of a deliberate path. So when wisdom fades, people become easier to steer. Trends replace principles. Opinions replace understanding. Identity becomes fragile, defended aggressively because it lacks depth. This is not a failure of individuals. It's the outcome of an environment that prioritizes speed over meaning. But here is the turning point. Wisdom does not require permission to return. It doesn't need institutions to approve it. It doesn't need trends to validate it. It begins the moment someone chooses to slow down and think for themselves. And that choice is radical, because choosing to think deeply in a shallow world is an act of resistance. Choosing reflection over reaction breaks the cycle. Choosing silence over noise creates space for something real to emerge. The system cannot give you wisdom, but it also cannot take it from you. Only you can do that. In the next session, we'll go even deeper beyond culture and systems into how the erosion of wisdom becomes a spiritual loss, hollowing out the inner life and leaving people disconnected from themselves. And we'll begin uncovering why wisdom is not just knowledge, but a way of being. If you want to continue this journey with us, subscribe to The Quiet Paradox. This channel is for those who still believe thinking deeply matters. When wisdom disappears from a culture, something deeper than intelligence is lost. The loss is internal. People still function, systems still operate, progress still appears to move forward, but inwardly something essential erodes. A quiet disconnection forms, not just from ideas but from the self. This is where the crisis becomes spiritual. Not spiritual in a religious sense alone, but in the sense of inner coherence. Wisdom has always been the bridge between the outer world and the inner life. It helped humans interpret suffering, success, failure, and mortality. It gave shape to chaos. Without it, life becomes fragmented. You may have noticed this fragmentation already. People know more than ever, yet feel less certain. They achieve more, yet feel less fulfilled. They are constantly stimulated, yet deeply bored. This contradiction is not accidental. It's the result of living in a world that feeds the mind but starves the soul. Wisdom nourishes the soul because it answers a different kind of question. Not how do I get more, but why am I here? Not how do I win, but what is worth winning? Not how do I appear, but who am I when no one is watching? These questions don't trend, they don't monetize easily, they don't offer instant gratification, so they are avoided. Instead, we fill the silence with identity, labels, roles, performances. We define ourselves by productivity, by status, by visibility. We turn life into a resume rather than an experience. But identity built on externals is unstable. When roles change, meaning collapses. When validation fades, anxiety rises. When performance stops, emptiness appears. This is the spiritual cost of a wisdom-starved world. The ancient traditions understood this well. Across cultures, wisdom was never separate from inner life. The Stoics spoke of aligning the soul with reason. Eastern philosophies spoke of dissolving ego and illusion. Mystics spoke of knowing oneself beyond appearances. All of them pointed to the same truth. Without inner clarity, outer success is hollow. But modern culture quietly teaches the opposite. It teaches us to ignore inner signals, to override intuition, to treat discomfort as a problem to escape rather than a message to interpret. We are taught to medicate symptoms instead of understanding causes. So people numb themselves with entertainment, with consumption, with constant movement. Stillness becomes threatening because stillness reveals. It reveals dissatisfaction you've been avoiding. It reveals contradictions you've been carrying. It reveals the gap between who you are and who you're pretending to be. Wisdom lives in that gap. That's why it's uncomfortable. To be wise is not to feel superior, it is to feel exposed. It requires honesty without self-deception. It requires admitting ignorance. It requires dismantling false narratives about who you think you are. That kind of inner work doesn't fit into a culture obsessed with appearance. So wisdom is replaced with confidence. Depth is replaced with certainty. Being is replaced with branding. and slowly the individual becomes hollow. This hollowness often shows up as anger, cynicism, or chronic dissatisfaction. People argue more but understand less. They defend identities fiercely because those identities are fragile. They react aggressively because reflection feels dangerous. A wise person doesn't need to shout. They are anchored internally. That anchoring is what's missing. And here's the uncomfortable truth most people avoid. A wisdom deprived society is not just noisy, it's easily controlled. Not through force, but through distraction. Not through oppression, but through indulgence. When people lack inner grounding, they look outward for direction. They follow trends, narratives, and leaders who promise certainty. They trade freedom of thought for emotional comfort. This isn't new. History shows that societies lose wisdom before they lose stability. When reflection disappears, manipulation increases. When meaning fades, extremism grows. When inner life collapses, people seek identity in tribes, ideologies, and conflict. Wisdom prevents this because it cultivates self-awareness. A self-aware person is difficult to manipulate. A reflective person questions emotional triggers. A grounded person doesn't need constant stimulation. That is why wisdom has always been quietly subversive. It doesn't overthrow systems. It dissolves illusions. And illusions are what keep people asleep. But here is the paradox. Even in a world that discourages wisdom, the longing for it never disappears. It shows up as a sense that something is missing, as the feeling that life should be deeper than this, as the discomfort that entertainment can't cure. That longing is not weakness, it is remembrance. It is the part of you that knows life is not meant to be lived entirely on the surface. Wisdom begins when you stop running from that feeling, when you stop silencing it with noise, when you stop explaining it away, when you let it ask its questions, not to answer them immediately, but to let them work on you. Wisdom is not something you acquire. It is something that emerges when illusions fall away. It emerges when you stop performing and start observing, when you stop reacting and start reflecting, when you stop chasing meaning and start listening for it. And this is where the path turns inward, not toward isolation, but toward clarity. In the final session, we'll explore how wisdom can be resurrected in everyday life, not as an abstract philosophy, but as a lived practice. We'll talk about the inner shifts, habits, and perspectives that quietly rebuild depth in a shallow world. Because wisdom does not return through revolution, it returns through individuals. And it may already be returning through you. Before we continue, take a moment to comment below. Share one thought from this session that made you pause or reflect. Let's create a space where depth is not ignored, but honored. Wisdom does not announce its return. It doesn't arrive with certainty or spectacle. It doesn't trend, it doesn't shout, and it doesn't demand attention. Wisdom returns quietly through small choices, subtle shifts, and moments most people overlook. That is why so many miss it. They are waiting for a breakthrough, a revelation, a dramatic awakening. But wisdom rarely arrives like lightning. It arrives like dawn, slowly, patiently, almost unnoticed until suddenly you see the world differently. To resurrect wisdom in your life does not require withdrawing from society or memorizing ancient texts. It requires something far more difficult. It requires honesty, radical, uncomfortable honesty with yourself. Wisdom begins the moment you stop asking, "What do I want right now?" and start asking, "What truly matters?" That single shift changes everything. It reorients your attention, your values, and your direction. Because wisdom is not about accumulation, it is about alignment. Alignment between your actions and your values, between your inner life and your outer behavior. between who you are becoming and who you pretend to be. This is why wisdom feels grounding. A wise person may still struggle, still fail, still feel pain, but they are not lost. They are oriented. They know what they stand for, even when the world is confusing. And orientation is rare today. Most people are pulled in dozens of directions at once. They are informed but not grounded, busy but not purposeful, connected but not centered. They mistake motion for progress and stimulation for meaning. Wisdom cuts through that illusion. It simplifies not by making life shallow, but by clarifying what is essential. To live wisely in the modern world, the first step is reclaiming your attention. Attention is not neutral. What you repeatedly focus on shapes your perception, your emotions, and ultimately your identity. A fragmented mind produces a fragmented life. So wisdom begins by choosing carefully. What you read, what you watch, what you listen to, what you allow to influence you. This is not about isolation or elitism, it is about stewardship. Just as you would not consume spoiled food, wisdom asks you not to consume spoiled ideas. Ideas that inflame without enlightening, content that entertains without nourishing, narratives that provoke fear without offering understanding. A wise life is not built on constant input. It is built on thoughtful digestion. The second step is learning to sit with silence. Silence is uncomfortable because it removes distraction. And when distraction disappears, truth surfaces. Not always pleasant truth, but necessary truth. Silence reveals patterns, it reveals avoidance, it reveals long ignored questions. That is why modern culture avoids it. But wisdom requires it. You don't need hours of meditation, you need moments of stillness. Walks without headphones, mornings without screens, pauses where you let thoughts complete themselves instead of interrupting them. In these moments, insight emerges naturally, not as answers, but as clarity. The third step is questioning your assumptions. Wisdom grows when certainty weakens, when you become willing to examine beliefs you've inherited rather than chosen. When you ask, why do I believe this? Instead of defending it automatically. This does not make you weak, it makes you sovereign. A wise person is not defined by rigid identity. They are defined by adaptability, grounded in principles. They can change their mind without losing themselves. That flexibility is strength. The fourth step is observing yourself without judgment. Wisdom is not moral perfection, it is self-awareness. It is the ability to see your patterns clearly, your fears, your ego, your habits, without pretending they aren't there. This is where most people turn away. Because observation without judgment removes excuses. You begin to see where you choose comfort over growth, where you seek validation instead of truth, where you react instead of respond. Wisdom doesn't shame you for this, it simply shows you. And seeing clearly is the beginning of change. The fifth step is living slowly but intentionally. Slowness is not laziness, it is presence. It is doing fewer things with greater awareness. It is choosing depth over volume. A wise life is not crowded. It has space for thought, space for feeling, space for meaning. When you slow down, you notice subtleties others miss. Tone beneath words, motivation beneath behavior, intention beneath action. This awareness changes how you relate to others. You stop needing to dominate conversations. You stop needing to win arguments. You stop needing to prove yourself. Because wisdom does not seek superiority. It seeks clarity. And clarity brings peace. But here is the most important truth of all. Wisdom is not something you find. It is something you become. It emerges through daily choices in moments no one applauds, in decisions that don't announce themselves, in how you speak when you could exaggerate, in how you listen when you could interrupt, in how you act when no one is watching. The modern world may glorify noise, speed, and superficiality, but you are not required to participate. You can choose depth, you can choose reflection, you can choose truth over comfort. And in doing so, you quietly rebel against a culture that profits from distraction. You become harder to manipulate, harder to rush, harder to deceive. Not because you are smarter, but because you are more aware. This is why wisdom has always mattered. Not because it makes life easy, but because it makes life real. So remember this: being loud is not being right, being popular is not being wise, being entertained is not being fulfilled. Wisdom may never go viral, but it endures. And in a world that forgets, remembering is a sacred act. Think deeply, live deliberately, and never underestimate the quiet power of a mind that sees clearly. This is not the end of the journey, it is the beginning.